Welcome back to our course on modern architecture, and in these lectures we're looking at Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, we have surveyed all of Wright's work, and now let's focus in a little bit on what was Wright's position in the 20th century. How does Wright's work relate to the 20th century? So we don't have time to look at his relationship to the other architects in this course. You can think about that as we go through the course. But I want to introduce an essay that Wright wrote called The Art and Craft of the Machine. So Wright wrote, "Nor was it so grown as to become apparent to William Morris, the grand Democrat, that the machine was the great forerunner of democracy." Now, William Morris is a social reformer, designer, critic, and he was objecting to the ugliness that industrialization was imposing on English life and the English landscape. And it's true. Initially, industrialization was very ugly, but we've cleaned up a lot of that, at least in Western countries. So how are we to think about the machine and art? And William Morris suggested that art would be a counter to the ugliness of the machine. And Wright's thought was, you know, if you put art up against the machine, which is going to win? By machine, we mean entire industrial culture. And the machine's going to win. So Frank Lloyd Wright said, no, the machine is the art form of the 20th century. So just the way the Greeks would use the cutting-edge material of their time, sculpting stone, to make their art, we should use the cutting-edge material of our time, here the Eiffel Tower, to make the art of our time. So Wright was very much a modernist architect in this sense. And here we see Wright using new industrial materials, poured-in-place concrete in Unity Temple and the Guggenheim Museum. Here we see Mondrian's abstract art, but 30 years earlier, Wright was doing that in Unity Temple, so he's engaged with abstract art. Now, when we talk about the human place with the Renaissance, and this idea carries all the way through to the 20th century, the human being is put in the center. So here we see in Palladio's Villa Rotunda, we put the human being in the center. Frank Lloyd Wright decentered us from the center. And it's very much a symptom of this 20th century, this decentering. So let's look at the world as it developed around Frank Lloyd Wright. When Wright was growing up, the Milky Way was the entire universe. By the 1920s, Hubble had discovered that there were other galaxies, billions and billions of them, and the universe was expanding. When Wright was growing up, we were in the midst of Newton's uniform space and time. In 1905 and 1915, Einstein introduced relativity. Space and time are distortable. When Wright was growing up, we had the privileged point of view of the observer, as we see in even in Impressionist art in Degas, very clear perspective. By the 1900s, Picasso and others had developed Cubism, in which the point of view of the observer is shattered. When Wright was growing up, novels were chronological, but then we get Proust, Joyce, Virginia Woolf introducing the notion of stream of consciousness. It's the experience of the observer that organizes things, not an abstract outside external reality. When Wright was growing up, humans were the favored children of the Creator. And then we get Darwin. Humans were on their own, just one more animal. When Wright was growing up, the small farm was a place of both production and consumption. But then we get, with industrial production, this gets split. You produce in the factory, you consume at home, and we have the creation of this new thing, the suburban house, and Frank Lloyd Wright pioneers the design of that. When Wright was growing up, Europe still had empires which saw themselves as descendants of Rome. After the First World War, those empires were gone, and Frank Lloyd Wright helped end their architecture. We can see here this National Gallery in Washington, D.C. as architecture of empire, and Wright does something very different. So, again, this is Wright's first building on his own, the Winslow House, and we go through this arch to the stables in the back, and this is Wright's proposal for a mile-high tower, and it's designed to have atomic-powered elevators. So these are the sweep of change of the 20th century that Wright lived through. So here's a question for you, because we're not in the 20th century anymore. How is our 21st century different from Wright's 20th century? Something for you to think about.